And now for my talk. As you can see, I'm calling it Milton's Logic and Other Surprises. I've italicized the word logic because that is the anglicized book title for it's a shortened title for the textbook that Milton wrote on logic that's sort of already been mentioned. Now, my title might raise a number of questions. Who's Milton, for one thing? Some of you were told, go to this talk and you'll get credit. So you might wonder why you're here. And why did he write a textbook on logic? And for that matter, what are those other surprises that you're referring to? In this talk, I will endeavor not only to answer those questions, but also to demonstrate what literary scholarship looks like. First, though, a bit more background on John Milton. And here he is. This important English poet lived from 1608 to 1674. He is best known as the author of Paradise Lost, a poem about the fall of Adam and Eve and their expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Sorry for the spoiler. Paradise Lost has been called the greatest long poem in English, and it is in fact 10,565 lines long. It is an epic, which before blockbuster Hollywood movies always referred to a long and heroic narrative poem. An epic is also encyclopedic. That is, it includes whatever knowledge is important to the society that produces it. Milton's Paradise Lost is no exception. It can be discussed in terms of law, science, medicine, history, music, theater, art, film, philosophy, psychology, education, disability studies, and the list goes on. But these topics never clutter up the poem. Rather, they work seamlessly with the narrative details and the other systems of meaning. One 18th century editor named Richardson marveled at how well the poem works. He says, "A reader of Milton must always be on duty. He is surrounded with sense. It rises in every line. Every word is to the purpose. There are no lazy intervals. All has been considered and demands and merits observation. Even in the best writers, you sometimes find words and sentences which hang on so loosely you might blow them off. Milton's are all substance and weight." I think Richardson is right, and I also find that Milton combines the sounds of his poetry to echo its sense. By the time he composed his epic, he had gone completely blind, and so the poem had to be dictated to one of the several young men who were happy to serve as his amanuenses, or secretaries, if you will. The epic was spoken before it was written. Just listen to how the sound of the poetry matches what it is about, just in the first 26 lines. "Of man's first disobedience and the fruits of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world, and all our woe with loss of Eden, till when greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat, sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb or of Sinai didst inspire that shepherd who first taught the chosen seed in the beginning how the heavens and earth rose out of chaos. Or if Zion hill delight thee more, and Siloa's brook that flowed fast by the oracle of God, I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song, that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Aeonian mount, while it pursues things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. And chiefly thou, O Spirit, that dost prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure, instruct me, for thou knowest. Thou from the first wast present, and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like satst brooding on the vast abyss, and madest it pregnant. What in me is dark, illumine. What is low, raise and support, that to the height of this great argument I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men." Now, I don't know if you heard everything with just one reading, But the water in Siloa's brook really does sound as if it is flowing fast by the oracle of God. And there really is a sense of tremendous space in the phrase, with mighty wings outspread. And one can feel the effort of lifting in what is low, raise and support. Just as there is a sense of descent, from the divine to the human in justify the ways of God to men. So the beginning answer to who is Milton is, he's the author of Paradise Lost. Some of you may also know John Milton as the author of Areopagitica, a prose tract arguing against pre-publication censorship. Milton admitted that he did not write prose as easily as he did poetry. Okay, he said he wrote it with his left hand. Nevertheless, there are some eminently quotable lines in the tract that have made their way not only into court cases on First Amendment rights, but even into public buildings, of which the most famous in America may be the one in New York Public Library. Here is inscribed from Areopagitica, a good book is the precious lifeblood of a master spirit, embalmed and treasured up on purpose to a life beyond life. John Milton was born in London in 1608 and spent most of his life there. I'm sorry I don't have a baby picture, but here is the present-day blue plaque from the street where he was born. Just to put this date into context, when Milton was born, the Jamestown colony had just been established in Virginia, and in London, William Shakespeare was still involved with the theater. In fact, Shakespeare knew Milton's father, at least through business dealings. In 1611, when Milton was 3 years old, the King James Bible was published. Shakespeare died in 1616, and the Pilgrims landed in Massachusetts in 1620, when Milton was nearly 12. By then, he had already been privately tutored and was attending a nearby local day school at St. Paul's Cathedral to prepare for university. Now, when I say St. Paul's Cathedral, I am not referring to the one you may have seen in London. That one was built pretty much after Milton's death. The St. Paul's that Milton knew looked like this. Well, only it looked better because this is a woodcut. It was one of the biggest churches in Christendom, as long as 2 football fields. New St. Paul's could have fit inside of it. It burned down in 1666 during the Great Fire of London. As a boy, John Milton knew he was very gifted, and he literally felt responsible for his God-given talents. He says so. So he studied very hard. In his youth, he typically stayed up studying to midnight. And by the way, it may surprise some of you to learn that his education was primarily in Latin, with some Greek and some other ancient languages thrown in. English did not become a language of instruction until later, and co-education much later even than that. In Milton's day, perhaps half of the male population attended school. Many fewer of them went to university, and girls of wealthy families might be educated at home. After studying at St. Paul's School, Milton attended Christ's College at Cambridge University for 7 years, after which he moved back in with his family and studied steadily on his own for another 5 or 6 years, which he could afford to do because his father had made rather a lot of money, and Milton never actually had to work for a living. But he did work because he felt obligated by his gifts to do so. All his study made Milton astonishingly learned. I'm guessing he was the best educated poet in English. He also went abroad in 1638 on a tour of France, Italy, and Switzerland, meeting celebrated authors and teachers, thinkers, seeing great art, and hearing great music. The picture here is a painting of Rome done in the 17th century and showing us what Milton might have seen. We do know that he met the elderly Galileo in Florence, where the astronomer was under house arrest. Milton had hoped to visit Greece as well, but he had to cut his travels short because of troubles in England. The trouble was partly religious. Milton had intended to be a minister in the Church of England himself, but he was of the persuasion that became known as Puritan. And you need to see that word in quotation marks because it is not what he called himself, nor did it mean what we think it means today. You know, someone terrified of sex and deeply opposed to anyone's being happy. Milton loved beauty and music and company. And in his Paradise Lost, Adam and Eve have sex in the garden before the fall. And they enjoy it. Even when Milton was in great pain from gout fits in later years, we are told that he would be cheerful and sing. If Milton had used the term Puritan for himself, he would have meant, along with many others, that the Church of England was still too much like the Roman Catholic Church from which it had separated and too little dependent on what the Bible said. So you might say, why was that a big deal? Why didn't he just look around and join some other denomination down the street? Because there weren't any other denominations. During most of Milton's lifetime, the Church of England was the only church available. So Milton decided against ordination, but troubles continued to grow among the population who were deeply divided between whether or not they wanted some kind of high church, we would say now, formalism, or something more akin to, I don't know, the baptistry down the road that wasn't there yet. But the troubles in religion were matched in that century with trouble in politics. Indeed, the two were impossible to separate. The church had political power in those days, and it was supported by the king, Charles I, who, by the way, looks remarkably like Alec Guinness, who actually played Charles I in a film in 1970. Charles was determined to rule as an absolute monarch. He even dissolved Parliament in 1629 and ruled for 11 years without it. But he had to call Parliament in 1640 when he finally ran out of money. Since then as now, it was the legislature who had to approve the budget. Now, by 1640, Parliament had a long list of grievances they wanted to fix first. Things got so bad that Charles left London in 1642 and declared war on Parliament. There was a devastating civil conflict that Parliament won, and the king was actually tried for treason and executed in 1649, after which the old memory of Charles began looking more like a martyr to his former subjects rather than a malefactor. This reaction was not lost on Milton. A few weeks after the execution, he published a tract in support of the regicide. You can get a sense of this tract from the title page. The tenure of kings and magistrates, proving that it is lawful and hath been held so through the ages, for any who have the power to call to account a tyrant or wicked king, and after due conviction to depose and put him to death. Milton's powerful argument attracted the attention of Parliament, who commissioned him to answer an international challenge, a defense of the executed King Charles, published by one of the world's then greatest scholars, Claude de Saumaise, or Salmasius of France. Here's Milton's answer. Where did I lose it? A defense of the English people, say Johannes Miltoni, by John Milton, Englishman. A defense of the English people. It was written in Latin, of course. For Milton to have published it was like David going out against Goliath. But David won. By the way, I looked for a good photo of Salmasius' title page, but I couldn't find one. It was an important book until along came Milton's, which in some circles was sort of a coffee table book. In between Salmasius printing the book and Milton responding, Salmasius had been invited to the glittering court of Queen Christiana of Sweden. After she read Milton's book, she apparently nicely asked Salmasius to leave. By the time Milton published this text, he was going blind. He was told by doctors that if he would just stop reading and writing, that he might be able to save his eyesight. But he decided that he had to keep on doing what he felt was his duty. The next year, his blindness was total. Despite his blindness, Milton actually worked after that for Oliver Cromwell, the increasingly important member of Parliament and military genius who led its army to victory against Charles I and who became the sole ruler of England in 1653. He was smart enough to turn down the crown, but it was beginning to look like the same tyranny all over again. Milton became his secretary for foreign tongues, meaning that he oversaw all diplomatic communication. And why not? Milton knew 10 languages. Cromwell died in 1658, plunging the country into chaos, from which another general, the new leader of the army, delivered it in 1660 by inviting Charles I's son back from exile in order to reestablish the monarchy in England. Milton thought this return was a very bad idea, and he actually published 2 tracts against it before the king arrived, and Milton went into hiding in fear of his life. As part of the treaty that allowed the return of Charles II, if you think that looks like Captain Hook, right? J.M. Barrie, who wrote the Peter Pan, actually said that James Hook styled himself after Charles II. So Disney got it right. Anyway, part of the treaty for this guy's coming back was that only a few people would be brutally executed for treason, and the rest of the country would be forgiven. Fortunately for us, Milton was included under the Act of Oblivion despite the books he had written, which meant that he could finally write his epic Paradise Lost. He published the first version in 1667, and then a slightly different version in 1674, not long before his peaceful death. He is buried in St. Giles, Cripplegate, London. So far, I hope I have answered the question, who's Milton? And also mentioned a few other surprises before I get to his textbook on logic. I can add to the surprise by telling you that he pronounced the letter R very hard. In his own time, that pronunciation was thought to indicate a satiric wit, although of course in our own time it means he talked like a pirate. It may also surprise you that Milton published a number of tracts in favor of divorce. And of course there was no connection between these and the fact that his young wife had left him a couple months after their marriage. They eventually reconciled. In fact, Milton wrote quite a number of different prose works. 5 tracts on appropriate church organization, 4 tracts on divorce, 1 argument for the freedom of press, 5 tracts related to the regicide, a history of Britain up to the Norman Conquest, a theological system, 7 works on various topics published just before the restoration of the monarchy, a grammar, and a history of Russia and its Asian neighbors. Among these varied works was his textbook on logic. He did not actually publish the logic until 1672, with a reissue in 1673, but at that point, he appeared to be publishing everything not yet in print. He was basically cleaning out his desk. We Miltonists are pretty sure that this textbook was written several decades earlier in the 1640s when Milton was tutoring his 2 young nephews. We might say he was homeschooled, or he was homeschooling them, except there weren't any public schools yet from which to keep children home. I've gotten to know this title page very well because one day I was contacted by Gordon Campbell, and you might, if you were here, he spoke in this room last October for this program, but he's also one of the general editors of a very ambitious new 11-volume edition of Milton's work to be issued by Oxford University Press. And Oxford wants this series of volumes to be the standard scholarly edition of Milton for the 21st century. No pressure, right? Gordon asked me if I would prepare an edition of Milton's Logic for Volume 9. I didn't say yes right away because the text is 240 pages long in Latin. And even though the pages are small, I mean, it's about 4 by 7, something like that, there's an average of 290 words on the page and a total of something like 45,000 words in this book. Here's an example of a page. It's also kind of hard to read. Before I could even begin transcribing the text, that is, typing it into my word processor, I had to do what bibliographers call a collation, or a comparison of each page of each copy to make sure that there were no differences in the text. And if there were differences, to determine which difference was the right one. You see, although texts today can be exact copies of each other, although not always, each page of text in Milton's time was set by hand, usually in a form the size of the sheet of paper that would be printed, and it'd be a big piece of paper because then it was folded into pages and sewn into the book cover, and only then were the pages cut. And I've got a couple pictures here of the process. You see over here, over here it looks like the compositors are taking the lowercase and the uppercase print. They put the lowercase letters below because they reached them more often. And then it looks like this man has got a form already ready to go into the printer, and this guy is checking it to make sure it's set properly. Over here, they're putting ink onto the form, and this chap over here has got the form with the paper and the ink, and he's literally pressing it. That's why we call it the press. And I think most of you may know that, but it's always fun to see. Here's another picture of the press from the period. Bibliographers need to do collations because sometimes during the process that you see, misprints would be found, and the mistake corrected. Somebody would take out one bit of type and put in the right one, but paper was too expensive to throw the bad sheet away. Paper accounted for 85% of the print company's overhead. So you didn't just get rid of a piece of paper. And knowing that, you have to make sure that if you're doing an edition, you look at every page of as many copies as you can find to look for differences, all right? So I'm thinking to myself, I have to get copies of Milton's Logic to look at from numerous rare book libraries, and there are over 100 such copies. And they're in numerous states and foreign countries. There's even one in Leningrad. Oh, sorry, I think it's St. Petersburg. But I was also being asked to translate 240 pages of English into English from what is known as Neo-Latin, and that's the more recent form of Latin that's been in scholarly use from 1375-ish till some people even say as late as 1900. So then I thought, well, why not? I'd always wanted to do a translation, and I'd learned enough Latin to read the Vulgate Bible and some other texts. I also knew that the best way to master a foreign language is to dive in, and here was deep water. When somebody asked me, is your Latin good enough for this project? I would say, it will be when I'm finished. But first, of course, I had to do the collation. I found out fairly early that getting copies of the Logic would cost me more than going to see them. Largely thanks to a Lucas grant, I was able to collate 50 copies of Milton's Logic. I was able to look at nearly half of the surviving copies. Mostly single copies at various libraries, but also a few treasure troves. And Urbana-Champaign, sorry, I'm stumbling. Urbana-Champaign Library has 9 copies of Milton's Logic, and 6 are at Christ College, Cambridge, which shouldn't be surprising because that's where Milton went to school. Milton was in this room. And you know, that people told me there, yeah, they always give it. If anybody wants to give us a copy of, of Milton, we always take it. So that's why they have so many. So what I ended up performing was the oddest kind of literary tourism. The book I was looking at was all the same, but everything around it was changing. I would be in a different library. I would be going to different places to get to the library. Lots of really great experiences I had. I took advantage of a conference at Dartmouth in New England to also visit Boston Old Public, Yale's Beinecke, Harvard's Houghton, and a wonderful drive through the Green Mountains of Vermont to the university there. I'm from Southern California, so I stayed near family while I looked at the 3 copies at the Huntington and the 2 at the Clark, and then I planned my travels. I found cheap lodgings in Cambridge, which is quite a trick, by the way. And early in the morning, I would ride a secondhand bicycle to the Cambridge rail station to take yet another train somewhere. I went to Birmingham, I went to Manchester, and I especially went to Oxford, where I looked at copies not just at the Bodleian, but also, here's the Bodleian, but also, hello, where did I lose it? At the colleges of Brasenose, All Souls, and Christchurch. And I would just like to point out, as a dyed-in-the-wool Harry Potter fan, that this is the library that is also used in the movie for Hogwarts Library. You can't see much of it. It's this spot right here. If you could go that way, there is a long series of shelves coming in that if you have seen Hogwarts Library, you have seen the Bodleian. But I also want to point out that this gallery here, you step up into this gallery, and those are chained books. And that was the forbidden book section from the movie, the first one. Okay, that was another kind of literary tourism. I could walk to the colleges in Cambridge, and there were a lot of them: Clare, Emmanuel, Magdalen, St. Catherine's, and St. John's, besides Christ College. My favorite time, though, might have been at the National Library of Wales, which may be the only national library in the world, and I've been to a number of national libraries, that has sheep grazing 40 feet from the door. I was also able to look at William Wordsworth's copy of The Logic, but it did not appear to ever have actually been read. I know that the one at Eton College was not read because the librarian had to cut the pages open for me. I could never have looked at all the copies of The Logic that I did without a wonderful suggestion that I got fairly early by Gavin Alexander of Christ College, Cambridge, and remember, this is Milton's College, that I make transparencies of each page to lay over individual pages of whatever copy I was collating. This procedure helped me greatly, but most photographic copies of the text were already skewed because the camera would pick up the curve of the paper going into the binding. And therefore, I had to spend time, I kept having to move the transparency around on the page. Now, that meant about a minute a page, or 4 hours a book. That takes a while. And then I got a lucky break because sorry, I don't seem able to be talking fast enough. Let me slow down. The time burden was considerably eased when Patrick Scott, Director of Special Collections at the University of South Carolina, isn't that pretty, provided an inexpensive PDF of a nearly flat-lying text that produced excellent transparencies. So that speeded it up. I think I got down to maybe 2 hours to go through the 240 pages. The individual pages I have shown you earlier are from that copy. So I looked at 50 copies of the text, or something like 12,000 pages, and I can now confidently tell you that there are no significant differences in any of them. None, okay? Granted, I have not seen the other 50-plus copies, but at this point, I'm willing to take it on faith. My next step was to transcribe the Latin text from the page to my word processor, and I would have preferred doing an optical character recognition, but no, I was told I really needed to hand put it in. And that was actually kind of nice because at some point I recognized a lot of what I was reading. And then I had to translate it from, again, Neo-Latin to English, but I lucked out there because the text has actually been translated twice before. So I would hammer out a paragraph, and then I would look at what they had, you know. And it was funny because one of the translations was really literal and hard to read, and the other was sort of too idiomatic. So I've been trying to steer a road between the two. But that was very helpful to have that backup. So what I am at now and nearly done is all of the other bits like the introduction, the footnotes. I've got the footnotes. I had to check all of the citations. Milton's Logic cites 500 different, there's 500 different quotations. I looked every one of them up, okay? And I also translated the Latin. I didn't do the Greek, but I translated the Latin from Virgil and everybody else by myself. So that was additional. But I still need to answer the question, why would Milton write a textbook on logic? For that, I should explain that education in Milton's time depended on the three verbal arts of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, known as the trivium. Grammar was the correct use of word forms and syntax, logic the correct practice of reason, and rhetoric the persuasive use of language. One needed to come to university already perfect at Latin grammar. You didn't do anything in English or French or, you know, any of the other European languages. It was Latin. You spoke Latin, you argued in Latin, it was all Latin. So you really had to know Latin by the time you got there. And ideally, one should know something about logic. Milton had a very, very ambitious program of learning. He actually wrote a model curriculum that included more authors than most students got before they got to university. And we also tend to think of of logic these days as mathematical or done in Venn diagrams. But back in Milton's day, logic was actually verbal, and all of those operations were done verbally rather than with very many, Venn diagrams. I mean, that's later in any case. And the relations of the verbal demonstration of reasoning was a system that pretty much went back to Aristotle. So the first book or section of Milton's logic sets up the definitions of his terms and the relations among ideas that constitute reasoning. I could give you all the names of the sections. Here's a few. Cause and effect, similarity, dissimilarity, greater, lesser, equal, subject, adjunct, relatives, adverses, contradictories, and so on. Having established these basics in the first book, Milton proceeds in the second book to put them together into syllogisms, okay? It's rather like having a vocabulary that you then make sentences with. But Milton did not make all this up himself. No one did. Most discussions of logic were based on other discussions of logic, and Milton particularly based his logic on a text that had been popular in England for 100 years. Here is Milton's title page again, and I will point out that he acknowledges his reliance on a French Protestant scholar named Pierre de la Ramée. It's, well, the Latin is different than the English, but it is the method. He puts his work of logic in the same way as that of Peter Ramus, or Ramus, some people say. Either is correct, I think. Milton's title tells us that his work is thus conformed to the method of Peter Ramus. It was Ramus who wrote the work on logic that Milton and many other Englishmen copied, but then they also adjusted it to their own purposes. Milton, for instance, found Ramus's discussion and explanations too short, so he added material back in. In fact, he called the text a fuller, plenior institution in the art of logic, which is how one can translate the first four words of the title. Ramus, Milton's source, lived from it's right there at the bottom, 1515 to 1572. He might have lived longer if he hadn't been slaughtered. And the word there is really trucidatus, slaughtered, massacred, butchered even, in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in Paris in August 1572, part of the French Wars of Religion. In this massacre, something like 3,000 French Protestants died in Paris alone, and tens of thousands in the rest of France. Protestant England didn't like that, and they took Ramus to heart, although I'm not sure he was a very nice person. He had a lot of enemies, and versions of his pedagogy proliferated. The earliest edition in English of his logic actually calls Ramus a martyr on the title page. I'm not going to trouble you with all the wonderful details that I could trouble you with about who wrote what in between 1572, which is the last date of his logic, and 1672, when Milton publishes the last recension in England of this logic. After that, logic did other things. But I did think I should explain to you what Milton was doing was not original in the modern sense of the word, but the unoriginality is the sort we encounter in textbooks, which is mostly a collection of public domain information that is then organized into a text. The reason that Milton wrote a textbook on logic is that he needed one. He was teaching his nephews and eventually some other boys as well. Milton liked Ramus's logic, but the version of it circulating in England was that final edition of 1572 that was pretty much a summary of principles without clarifying examples. The first chapter is one sentence long, so you needed some more stuff. We now have evidence that Ramus moved all his examples into an additional text for the teacher, possibly to make the student edition more affordable, but if so, what got to England was the student edition, not the massive collection of scholii that should have accomplished it. The final surprise that Milton wrote a textbook has been voiced by no less than his best-known 20th century biographer, William Riley Parker. Doesn't that sound like the name of a detective or something? I'm going to call in William Riley Parker. One of the great names in Milton scholarship, Parker complains that Milton's logic doesn't sound anything like his poetry, as if it should. In fact, he says, when Milton was not in the mood for poetry, he was sometimes capable of the most arid pedantry. Parker manifestly did not know the Ramus tradition in England, since he is expecting Milton's school text on logic to sound as thrilling as his poetry or controversial prose. And Milton himself tells us why there's a difference. In one of his earliest prose works, Milton distinguishes between the plain style of a teacher, calling for staid moderation, soundness of argument, and cool, unpassionate mildness of positive wisdom, and the very different tone required for correcting false religious doctrines, when zeal, whose substance is ethereal, arming in complete diamond, ascends his fiery chariot, drawn with two blazing meteors, figured like beasts, resembling two of those four which Ezekiel and St. John saw, the one visage like a lion to express power, high authority, and indignation, the other of countenance like a man to cast derision and scorn upon fraudulent and perverse seducers. Arr! Textbooks then must be tame and dull, almost by definition. Sorry, guys. What one asks for in a textbook is a clear and authoritative exposition of the topic, and that's what Milton provides. Milton probably wrote this placid school text in the same decade. He was calling for the freedom of the press, asking for the church to be reformed, suggesting better educational curricula, urging divorce for incompatibility, and finally insisting that a tyrant be overthrown. But during the same period, Milton was also teaching school. He committed himself to the patient and hopeful effort of raising a new generation of scholars in the very shadow of civil war, maybe like a world like ours. I will surely never be a poet like Milton, but I can be committed to sharing his genius with my own scholars. Thank you.